Good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone. It is my honor, I feel humbled as a teacher of civics and political science. It is my honor to chair and moderate what is certainly the most distinguished panel on the subject of voting rights I've ever been in the same room with. I will not spend a lot of time rehearsing their biographies for you. We gave you those in written form, and you came to hear them, not me. But I will very briefly tell you a few relevant facts about each of our panelists, beginning immediately to my right with the Honorable Eric Holder, who was, of course, the Attorney General for many years during the Obama administration, the first African American to hold that office, and one of its longest incumbents. And he is now doing very important work at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. To his right is Maria Teresa Kumar, who is the president and CEO of Voto Latino, which is doing very important work, particularly with younger Latinos in the area of voter registration, voter engagement, political engagement. And Ms. Kumar is also an Emmy-nominated contributor to MSNBC. Immediately to her right is the Honorable Andrew Gillum, who was, of course, the mayor of Tallahassee, and the candidate who would have won the 2018 Florida election absent voter suppression. And Mr. Gillum is now the chair of Forward Florida, which is doing very important work in the field that we are discussing today. And on the far right is Ari Berman, who is a journalist at Mother Jones. You've heard the expression, write the book. Well, Ari has written the book on voting rights. And if you haven't read it, I commend to you all the book, which is called Give Us the Ballot, a line taken from Martin Luther King's speech. And so in a fundamental way, the story of American democracy and American freedom is the story of the expansion of citizenship and of the most important right associated with citizenship, the right to vote, to those that have been excluded. And while this is a story that has seen many important advances over the course of our history, we've also seen some serious setbacks. And so the political terrain of voting rights is complicated, and I think we're going to see some of the interesting complications today in our discussion. But it demands of us particularly a thoughtful approach as we move forward on many different fronts. And in particular today, one thing I think that we're going to try to connect is the relationship between voter suppression, that is attempts to keep actual people from voting, particularly people of color, poor people, younger people, and extreme gerrymandering, that has a partisan political nature to it, I think, but we will also find in our discussion that partisan political nature also ends up often in racial gerrymandering. And so today I think we hope to address both sides of that issue and make that connection. So Ari, as the scholar of voting rights on this panel, Could you start us off by providing some historical context for the conversation? What do we need to know about the history of voting rights and voter suppression to make sense of the current moment?
Sure, absolutely. I think everyone's probably a scholar of voting rights on this panel, but I'll do my best and go first. And I just want to say it's an honor to be on this panel, and it's an honor to be here. And thank you to Leo and the Shanker Institute and AFT and Secretary Clinton and Onward Together for hosting this really important gathering. And maybe if we had more of these gatherings before the 2016 election, things might have turned out a little bit differently. So in terms of the historical context, today is Constitution Day. And there is this fundamental contradiction in our Constitution, which is that the Founding Fathers said all men are created equal. We'll leave out the fact that they excluded women from that. But they said all men are created equal, but they didn't believe that all men or all women should be able to vote. And most states at the time of the founding explicitly said that only white male property owners could vote, meaning that most people here and most other people on this panel would not have been able to vote at the time of our founding. And I think you really have to understand that fundamental contradiction to understand what's going on today. And then even 100 years later, when we have explicit guarantees in the Constitution saying you cannot deny or abridge the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Those words mean something, but only for a very, very brief period of time during Reconstruction. And then we overlook the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. And we get Jim Crow and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and poll taxes and all of the things that disenfranchise African Americans and others in the Jim Crow South for so many years. And so then America has another contradiction, which is that we are the only advanced democracy that's ever disenfranchised, re-enfranchised, disenfranchised, and then eventually re-enfranchised an entire segment of the population. And then, of course, that eventually leads to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And it's a monumentally important piece of legislation that gives millions of people the right to vote, but it's challenged from the inception. And so it's not like John Roberts woke up one day in June of 2013 and decided he didn't like the Voting Rights Act when he decided to gut it. It was a product of a 50-year campaign against the Voting Rights Act and against voting rights that really dates back all the way to our country's founding. And so I can go through all the different voter suppression tactics today. I can talk about the voter ID law in Texas where you can vote with a gun permit but not a student ID. I can talk about how 1,600 polling places have been closed since 2012. I can talk about voter ID laws in Wisconsin that kept tens of thousands of people from the polls in 2016. But I don't think you can understand the totality of these efforts without understanding the history of voter suppression that I believe still plagues this country today.
Thank you. Attorney General Holder, for a number of years, you were responsible for enforcing the nation's civil rights laws. And one of the most important of those laws is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Could you share with us your view of the law and its purposes and what challenges you faced as Attorney General in trying to enforce it?
Well, I think following on what Ari said, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, I think, is justifiably called the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. I think it helped to end an American apartheid system, enfranchised people all over the country, and in particular the South, where people had so long been denied access to the ballot. It was, as Ari says very correctly, something that was opposed from the beginning. But I think we also need to understand that the Supreme Court, as an institution, has not been protective of minority voting rights from the period of Reconstruction. There's that slight period, there's the Warren era, and everybody tends to think, well, that's the Supreme Court, and that's not the Supreme Court. The history of the Supreme Court is very, very different. Using the passage of the Civil Rights amendments, the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court has more traditionally used that to protect corporate interests as opposed to protecting the rights of the newly freed people. The Voting Rights Act was central to what we used in the Justice Department. Justice Department Civil Rights Division was created in 1957. the Voting Rights Act 1965 gave us a tool because we had the ability to use the pre-clearance provision that was gutted in the Shelby County decision. It really kind of angers me that the decision is a Shelby County versus Holder decision. You know, it's like my name's on like Dred Scott versus, you know.
It's a real sore point.
Right, that's a real sore point.
It reminds me.
Right, so we just call it, for purposes of today, just the Shelby County decision, and forget my name was on there. But by gutting the pre-clearance provision, that allowed the states to do a whole variety of things that otherwise would have been challenged by the Justice Department. The number of poll closures, the movement of poll closures, a whole range of things that were done after Shelby County, and I think very presciently predicted by Justice Ginsburg in her dissenting opinion. It was interesting, the thing that always sticks in my mind in that opinion, in her dissenting opinion, is she said, you know, just because you're, paraphrasing, you're standing in a thunderstorm with an umbrella over your head and you're not getting wet, doesn't mean you pull the umbrella down and think that you're going to stay dry. And that's exactly what happened. You know, statute was gutted, the umbrella came down, and then these states came in and imposed these unnecessary and discriminatory voter ID laws, and did a whole range of other things, and took a tool away from the Justice Department that would have been willing to continue to fight. That might have not have made, doesn't make a huge amount of distance with this Justice Department, who I don't think would, under Sessions, Whitaker, and Barr, would have been making much use of the Voting Rights Act.
Could you address the argument, which I think underlies the recent Supreme Court decision, that the Voting Rights Act only protects against forms of racial discrimination, and so what we're talking about is partisan gerrymandering, and that's not really under the purview of the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, I mean, that's nominally true, but there's a confluence of partisan gerrymandering with racial gerrymandering. African Americans, people of color, largely seen as Democratic voters. The measures that have been put in place to make it more difficult for Democrats to vote are, I think, disproportionately aimed at people of color. And so the Voting Rights Act certainly could have been used to deal with those issues. And you know, there's the remaining parts of the Voting Rights Act, especially Section 2, which is a nationwide provision in the Voting Rights Act, is still something that exists and is still viable. But that is an after-the-fact remedy, as opposed to the pre-clearance provision, which stops states from doing things that they wanted to do before they were actually put in place.
Thank you. Maria Teresa Kumar. Since the 1965 Voting Rights Act came out of the civil rights movement and the African American freedom struggle, I think often we tend to think of it only through that lens. Could you tell us what we need to know about the history of voting rights and voter suppression for Latinos and other people of color, and why the Voting Rights Act is important for your community?
Absolutely. Well, it was because of the mobilization of the African American community that many Latinos were able to be enfranchised under the 1965 law. And I say many because it specifically said that you had to be English dominant. You actually had to be able to speak English in order to access the ballot. And that let a whole swath of Latinos and Asians that were not able to participate, including Native Americans. And it wasn't until 10 years later that they addressed the issue of language, where all of a sudden, not just native speakers of Spanish, but also Puerto Ricans, for example, that may have not been fluent in English, but were on the island, that they too can participate. And that's important because that means that for the Latino community, for the Asian community, for the Native American community, we have not been, quote unquote, totally enfranchised with access to the voting booth since 45 years ago, in the totality of our American history. And when you fast forward to the issues of why we're having this struggle right now with who has and who doesn't have access to the polls, in 2010, we had a census. In that census, in Shelby County, the Latino community grew by 122%. It is not a surprise that 3 years later, there was this piece of legislation to disenfranchise a community that right after that act was passed, the Supreme Court ruled on it, you had 22 jurisdictions that went on the heels of trying to dismantle enfranchisement of the booth, and they had all had at least a 60% growth in the Latino community. And it wasn't that they were going to be able to vote in 2014. No, they were seeing into the future. In 2020, for the very first time, the Latino vote is going to be the second largest vote in American history. And while the majority of white voters are 54 years old, the majority of Latino voters are going to, the majority of Latinos are going to be 19 years old. So it was looking at the maps, whether you're looking at Texas, whether you're looking at Georgia, whether you're looking at Florida, where they not only just started dismantling access to the polls, but then most recently, when we saw this case of whether or not to include citizenship on the census, we found the GOP receipts on an email that specifically said when they were talking about how to draw districts, they literally wrote in one of the emails that they were trying to ensure GOP, white Republican, non-Hispanic districts. And that's what the citizenship question was going to serve them. So it wasn't even that they were trying to draw Republican districts. They wanted to ensure that they were white, non-Hispanic districts. And so when we talk about what is the fight for our democracy, if we truly believe in Constitution Day and the Constitution, that is about the enfranchisement of the totality of the American people to do the will of the American people, this is everybody's fight. And it is a fight that is not about party, but it's about country and our values and what we expect to ensure that we're not only doing in this country, but that we're able to export these values externally into the international realm. But we can't do that if we take any of this for granted. And it is definitely a fight because, again, we have a major demographic generational shift that we're experiencing. My children are 7 years old and 5 years old. My daughter, who's in second grade, she represents the first majority minority America. Our future is here, and we better fight like hell for them.
Thank you. Mayor Gillum, you've, as an elected official and a candidate for governor in Florida, you've seen this issue of voter suppression up front in perhaps a way no one else on the panel has. What do we need to know about voter suppression on the ground and how it's operated in Florida?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I also take it in your introduction that I shouldn't have to disclose that I'm a little biased in this conversation. Having just come out of the 2018 election cycle in the state like Florida, I do want to thank the Shanker Institute, also Randy Weingarten and the great folks at AFT, and obviously Secretary Clinton and the work of Onward Together. I said this when Secretary Clinton came down to Florida to work with me in my race. This is a woman who owes none of us anything. A woman who herself and her family have given tirelessly to this country. And the fact that even though her name is not on the ballot, these kinds of questions around elections integrity and how we ensure that democracy is truly fulfilled, and the fact that she continues to be at the apex of these conversations, I think we all owe her a debt of gratitude for continuing that work. Sincerely. Now, the way that this shows up on the ground, and I have the firsthand experience of what it has been to watch. And I realize that this isn't a partisan conversation, so when I refer to Republicans and Democrats, these are statements of fact. That since Republicans came in control of the Florida legislature and the closeness of the races that we've seen over the last 2 decades in Florida, they really did turn their attention to all of the kind of legislative mechanisms that they could put into place that, in my opinion, would help to impact and weigh on the outcome of the election. And we don't have to look any further back than the 2000 election that came down to literally one vote, a 5-4 decision at the courts, and 537 votes in the state and 20,000 votes in Duval County that never got counted, largely from communities of color. The Republicans in Florida decided that they were going to go the good step of beginning to criminalize voter registration. Now, what do I mean by that? So a lot of folks in my state were doing voter registration on their church pews. They were going from neighbor to neighbor. The League of Women Voters would fan out all across the state, registering their neighbors and friends, unions, so on and so forth. And so they concocted a scheme that basically said in order to register a voter, you had to become a registrar with the state, go through a particular training, be assigned a specific number unique to you and your own registration efforts, and that every registration card has to have that number affixed to it, and that if you didn't turn that card in within 72 hours after completion, you could be criminally prosecuted. They then tested that in North Florida with 4 black school teachers in a rural, heavily minority county, where these women were registering young people and students and their neighbors and fellow parishioners, and the state attorney in that area decided that they were going to prosecute those women. Now, we were able to intervene and to quiet that, but you understand what a chilling effect that had to have created for folks. So groups like the League of Women Voters decided, we got to pull out of a state like Florida from doing wholesale voter registration. But it didn't stop there. This thing shows up. You heard earlier the example in Texas around your hunter's license being counted as a valid identification, yet your student ID issued by the state is not a valid identification. And my state, in this last election, we even have something called signature match law, which Florida isn't the only one. There are other states who have it, which basically allows for volunteer elections official who has no training, forensic or otherwise, in signature analysis, to determine that the W in my signature this year didn't look like the one from 5 years ago, and that individual could then invalidate my vote. The University of Florida did a study that showed that of those votes that were invalidated due to signature mismatch, 7 out of 10 were from either a young voter or a voter of color in the state of Florida. So if we think by any stretch of the imagination that we're being hyperbolic or over dramatic in this conversation, the truth is in a state like mine, and I'm not the only one, we're a state that you win and lose by 1%. The last 5 races for governor were lost, well, the last 4 were lost by Democrats by 1 point. Secretary Clinton in the state of Florida, 1 point. Barack Obama won the state twice by 1 point. And in my race, I lost the race for governor by 0.4%, 30,000 votes out of 8.5 million votes cast. And so when I think about the scale of these kinds of efforts to suppress the vote, a lot of us are waiting for the big shoe to drop, where we see millions of people that are disenfranchised in a single election, in a single place or in a single district. But that's not how it works. They chip away at it 1 vote at a time, a few votes each county at a time. And in a state where elections can come down to 1% of the vote, you don't have to steal everybody's vote in order to flip the outcome of an election. You just got to take enough. And that's what they understand on the other side of this fight, that they're not just fighting to win, they are fighting to stay in control and empower into perpetuity. Regardless of what the demographic shifts are, they're aligning through redistricting efforts, through these races at the legislative level, and obviously the codification of law, trying to figure out ways that they can slow down what is the inevitable, and that is the rapidly shifting and changing demography of this country. In a state like mine, and the longer they can hold that off from one decennial census to the next decennial census to the next decennial census, then they can keep us perpetually the majority acting in the minority.
So I want to turn now to what we need to do to address what is clearly a major critical problem for our democracy. And each of you up here have been champions of this work. And we want to hear from you what you and your organizations and what's happening out there. So let's start with what should be done on the national stage. The House of Representatives passed a bill, H.R. 1, which is a comprehensive approach to the question of voting rights. It lays down markers for what Democrats would do if they take back the Senate and the White House in 2020. And one might even call it the 2020 Voting Rights Act. Ari Berman, could you start us off with what's in this bill and why is it important?
So HR 1, which is called the For the People Act and has already passed the House, really is the most sweeping democracy reform plan since Watergate. In many ways, the voting rights provisions are the most significant voting rights provisions since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I mean, the bill does so many important things. When it comes to voting rights, it has things like nationwide automatic registration, nationwide same-day registration, 2 weeks of early voting, an end to voter purging. So that's all on the voting rights part. It also says that states should do independent redistricting commissions, which I know Attorney General Holder has advocated for a long time. When it comes to money in politics, it does public financing of congressional campaigns. There's also ethics provisions, lobbying provisions, things, for example, that a president has to release their tax returns, a very radical and revolutionary idea. But I think, there's a lot of stuff in the bill. I think the big picture is significant for two reasons. Number one, this was the first bill that House Democrats introduced, and one of the first bills they passed. And I think that's really, really important because in my view, Democrats have to be as aggressive in fighting voter suppression as Republicans are in doing it. And I haven't always seen that to be the case. There are states like New York, where I live, that for many years lagged on this. And now we finally have early voting and some other things in New York. But for a long time, we didn't. And yes, Republicans controlled one branch of the legislature, but quite frankly, there were a lot of Democrats that didn't really want this stuff either, that wanted to protect their own power too. So I think it was a powerful statement by House Democrats right at the gate to say, we wanted to make it easier to vote. We want to democratize the system no matter who it benefits. Then, of course, Mitch McConnell said that one part of the bill, probably the most uncontroversial part of the bill, making Election Day a federal holiday, would be a power grab for Democrats, which was, it's just a window into the soul of Mitch McConnell that he believes that making
you're working under the assumption that he has a soul.
Yeah. So, well said. So,
that was nice.
But the most basic things that would have provoked no debate 20 or 30 years ago, now Mitch McConnell's blocking them. So it's significant because it was their first bill. Then I think it was significant the fact that this was all put together. Because for a long time, you had the voting rights people here, and the money in politics people here, and the corruption people here, and they were all kind of in different spaces. And I think now everyone's realizing that these issues are connected, right? That you have to have a strong right to vote, but you also have to have someone to vote for. Right? And you also have to have a system that people believe in. They don't believe is tainted by money or the elections are predetermined by gerrymandering. So I think it was very significant, both what was in the bill, but also how it was rolled out. And hopefully it's something that people keep talking about, right? Because this can be something that people can campaign on. Senators can talk about it, other people can talk about it. It should really be something that becomes a central focus of the next presidential race, which, as Secretary Clinton said, there have now been 30 presidential debates in 2016 and 2020, but not a single question about voting rights. So if the media is not asking about it, clearly I am not moderating these presidential debates, or else it would be the first question asked. But if the media is not talking about it, the candidates should still talk about it and talk about what their agenda is for democracy.
Thank you.
And to be fair to the candidates, we've tried to do at the NDRC, we've gotten all the presidential candidates to sign a pledge that they will will raise the issue of partisan gerrymandering and to support steps at fighting partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. So they have at least signed up to it, but they tend to have to respond to the questions that are put to them by these moderators.
I've also observed, some of the hesitance by candidates to really lift this to a broad audience, because a lot of us feel like the more we talk about it, and I know I encountered this on the trail where I would knock on a door and I'd tell people I needed their vote and if they could, just come out and sacrifice a couple of hours or whatever it would took. And I get waved off in some cases and they say, well, they're going to do what they want to do anyway. That there is this belief that, and this is probably the most insidious and long-term impact of voter disenfranchisement, is that over time you convince the individual, the voter, that they actually have no role in the process because in spite of their participation, the people who want power and to hold power and to control it are going to figure out a way to move them out of the process anyway. And my response, and sometimes it was successful and sometimes it was not, was simply say, listen, if somebody is working that hard to silence you, then they must know that you are a powerful force to be reckoned with, or otherwise they wouldn't be putting that much effort into keeping you out of the process. Mm-hmm. So you're gonna lay down and let them run right over you, or are you gonna get in this thing and fight for it? Now, it could work for some. Others were like, bruh, whatever. But my point is, I don't know about you, but I'm gonna stand up and fight. I'd love for you to join me in that. But I know that that's a pull and a tug for some folks, that if you raise this thing to the specter of folks who already don't feel like they are gonna be counted in the process, do we do ourselves some harm? I disagree with that, but I think that that's one of the operating sort of beliefs for some people here.
But I think the governor raises, a good point. That really kind of.
I heard that.
Huh? Yeah.
A good point.
I got the governor here and I got the president over there. And so. And we have to understand that the Republican Party is comfortable being a minority party that exercises majority power. Yep. They're okay with that. And unless we understand that and are prepared to fight in the way that you described, they'll run the table to the extent that they can.
Every time.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that we also, because we encounter a lot of this, and it makes sense, right? If you are a young person and you walk out of your house and all the systems are broken for you, it's really hard for you to engage and say that government works for you. And one of the things that I found the most dangerous in the 2016 election was when certain candidates and surrogates were saying that the system was rigged. That made my work harder. And what I would remind these young people is that it's not rigged, it's occupied. And the system works as it should for those individuals who occupy the system. And that is why they prevent our vote. And when I look at the silver lining, I remind folks now that what happened in 2018 was that we mobilized young people. One out of every 5 voters were young people. We've never seen that. I've been doing this a minute. Don't do math. And in Texas, we had 2 out of 5 Texans were Latino. Again, we've never seen that. And Texas went from the lowest voting propensity state historically to 41. When you ask why don't they want to accept voter IDs for student IDs for voting, it's because we're talking about 3.5 million young people in Texas who are unregistered. When Beto O'Rourke lost by less than 200,000 votes, and Secretary Clinton lost by less than 500,000 votes, it's at play. And they're deeply afraid of it being at play. So we look at when we look at the future in 2020, for the very first time, we're going to have 12 million more young people eligible to vote than baby boomers. It'll be the first time in our history where young people can drive this ship. So when folks are saying it doesn't matter, when folks keep saying it doesn't matter, I said, no, our work is to register a whole hell of a lot of voters, right, to expand that electoral map in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Arizona, and occupy the institutions so that the issues that we care about are getting addressed. And I think one of the biggest challenges is when we talk about, oftentimes in 2016 we talk about, well, African Americans didn't show up to how they used to. Just in North Carolina alone, 200 voting booths went missing.
Yeah.
That's by design. In Florida, we had to do partnerships with Lyft because the university campuses used to have voting booths, and all of a sudden they had to drive 18 miles to go into the voting booths. That's by design. So unless we are clear on who they're trying to disenfranchise and why, they will continue being comfortable being the minority majority, but then we are not talking about the democracy that we also claim to espouse.
And we got to be prepared come 2020 to drive that 18 miles, to wait in line 4.5 hours to vote, all of which is unfair. But if we want to occupy the spots that make those determinations, we're going to have to put up with that at least for one cycle.
Right.
If we are sufficiently motivated and we get significant numbers of people out there, 2022 can be fundamentally different. But
Absolutely.
2020 is going to be hard.
Yeah.
And we can't kid ourselves. It's going to be inadequate numbers of polling places. There are going to be all kinds of tricks played, social media, Russians or whoever. but we've got to be prepared to fight. And people say to me, well, boy, that's really difficult. It's like, really? I think about, what Dr. King and John Lewis put up with, That was difficult. Thurgood Marshall going in and trying cases by himself and having to get out in the middle of the night out of fear that he'd be lynched. That was difficult. Driving 18 miles and waiting in line 4.5 hours to vote.
That's
it's
inconvenient.
Not fair.
That's inconvenient.
That's inconvenient.
Right.
And given the stakes, it's the price that we ought to be prepared
But
to pay.
I do want to underscore with the work, when we're talking about the work that you're doing about redistricting, and we're talking about the census that is also coming up in 2020, that has disproportionately spooked a lot of people of color and immigrant communities, that our job is, we know what we need to do in this election. We know that we need to over-register our friends and family. The fact that 123 million Americans sat it out that last election is not okay. And we have to have these conversations. And it is peer-to-peer. We do a lot of peer-to-peer work, and we find that when you talk to a friend, that person trusts you more than anybody. And so when someone says, I'm not registered to vote, don't date them, really.
So
Certainly don't marry.
So that's one technique.
You'd be surprised.
If you could, the work that Voto Latino did in 2018 was very important and very innovative. And if you could tell us a little bit about that work and how you plan to move that forward into 2020.
Yeah, so in Voto Latino, we started focusing on young Latinos back in 2004 because we recognized that long before they turn 18 years old, they are making decisions for their parents. That is why corporations spend billions of dollars trying to get them to basically buy that refrigerator and buy that car for them. And so we designed a program that was specifically online in English, targeting them. When we were out of the gate, people thought we were nuts. They kept telling us that young people don't vote, that they don't care. That was never my experience. I was translating in my family since I was 9 years old, in doctor's offices, through bosses, not doing so well when it came to translating my teacher-parent conferences. My mother caught on. But one of the things that we knew was that we were the lifeline in many cases. And so we started registering voters at 2,400. Last year in Voto Latino registered 202,339 people. 77% of the people that we registered voted. We directly registered 15% of all Texans. It's work that I'm mighty proud of because it's not the sexy work, but it's the work that people really feel a change. And it was behind a backdrop where now when people say my vote doesn't matter, all we have to do is look at all the legislative wins that Congress has done since we voted in the most diverse Congress. We have a modernization of our election system. We're talking about equal pay. We're talking about DACA, TPS. We actually passed background checks for the first time in 25 years. We now have a contrast of this is what happens when legislators look like you, think like you, believe in you, compared to Mitch McConnell, who's just stalling. And as we move forward, our job at Voto Latino is, again, trying to give young people agency. We developed an app called Voter Pal, and it allows you to register your friends and family. But what it really does is also circumvent these laws that make you have to be deputized. In Texas, in order to register to vote, you have to be deputized. In Georgia, if you're going to be registered to vote, you have to show someone that you have a birth certificate when you're on the soccer field playing with your kids. Come on now. And so Voter Pal allows you to do the work by giving it to your friend, and it says give it to your friend now, and it allows you to register, and then we are able to chase them. Voter Pal alone was charged with 10% of all our registered voters. We expected one person to download it and to register about 2 or 3 people. They registered 11 people on average. People are excited and they want engagement and they want agency. And then we worked a lot on redistricting. Anytime there was an issue of whether or not something was a group was eligible, we would sign a lot of the amicus briefs along them, and we're always very supportive of the work that the Secretary does, because it's incredibly important to enfranchisement. And we didn't get involved in voting rights work until 2010, when we saw that it was disproportionately impacting the Latino community.
Thank you. Mayor Gillum, you're doing important work in...
Governor. It's Governor.
Governor Gillum.
We're back to alternative universe.
You're doing some very important work in Florida with Forward Florida Action. And I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, and if you also might want to touch upon an issue many of us have been following, which was in 2018, we thought that this referendum, which gave the franchise back to former felons who had served their sentences, was a huge step forward. And what we're hearing in the press is that the Republican legislature and governor is undermining the kind of will of the people.
That's right. Yeah, they are. And for me, it was after sort of getting over the loss of 2018, and it depends on the day whether I'm over it, but today we are doing a good job at being over it for the purposes of this conversation. But one of the things that we had to go back and see, and I encourage all of us, regardless of what the outcome of these races are, is, my grandmother used to say, when you know better, you do better. And so I know some things that I didn't know before, and now there are some steps we can take to do something about it. So when Barack Obama was on the ballot in Florida in 2008, Democrats had a registration advantage over Republicans of more than 700,000 more registered Democrats than Republicans. 10 years later, when I was on the ballot in the state of Florida, that advantage had shrank to fewer than 250,000. Add whatever the suppressive tactics are in the process, and you can see how it is that you find yourself in a perpetually close state, very close races. And so what we committed to after the race was, after seeing such a precipitous decline in registration, is that we were going to commit to not just going out and doing 501c3 registration, which is important. And there are communities where C3 registration makes great sense. It's your civic duty, go get registered. But in a state like Florida, particularly where you have a Latino community that is so diverse, where folks come from countries that have multiples, dozens of party affiliations, and some the inverse of how they're described here in the United States, if we're not talking to them about Donald Trump, what he's doing, what it means to be a Republican, how they comport themselves here in mainland United States, and why it is that you ought to make another choice, then I fear that we may be enlisting people in a political system that they may or may not be as well oriented around who's on their side and who isn't on their side. And so we've chosen to go very directly at, yes, 501c3 registration and supporting that effort, but also C4, hardcore political conversations about what folks need to do. And our commitment has been through a consortium of organizations that we're working with, because I'm so sick of Florida being a cheap date. We're not even a cheap date, we're an expensive date. And what I mean by that is folks don't put resources onto the ground until the very last minute. I'm sick of showing up 6 weeks out from an election, trying to tell folks who never met me and don't believe in me that this is the most important election that we've ever faced, and that's why it's important for you to get out, register, and vote. We're trying to build a relationship that lasts inside of an election cycle as well as outside of an election cycle. And so far, we've enlisted some 40-plus groups on the ground. Our goal is to enlist 300 groups on the ground as partners, people who are seated in the community, who have core competency with the people that they're talking to, their neighbors, they live with them. And our stated goal is to register and re-engage 1 million new Floridians in the presidential election of 2020. And we're committed to trying to make that happen. To your point, again, around what the other side will do to make this difficult, first of all, there are 4 million individuals in Florida who are eligible to register and are unregistered. Right? That's 4 million. That's not to include the 1.4 million returning citizens who in Florida, one of the 4 states remaining bastions of the old Jim Crow South, where if you had a felony conviction, you were permanently removed from the voter rolls. So in 2018, when I was on the ballot, 65% more votes than the governor got, more votes than I got. 65% of the people in the state of Florida decided that they were going to change Florida law and change it in such a way that certain crimes that were committed, which covered about 1.4 million people, that if you paid your debt to society vis-a-vis your sentence, that you would be eligible to then register and vote. Sheena and Desmond Meade and a number of folks put a lot of work in on the ground to see that amendment come to fruition. We said unapologetically in Florida that we were going to be a forgiving state, that we were not going to be a state that judges everybody by their worst day. And the Republicans then came back into session And they saw that in the first 3 months of this law being on the books starting January 8th of the 18th, that even though black voters are estimated to be maybe 30-40% of that 1.4 million, almost 60% of the new registrations had come from black folks. They didn't like that trend. And so what did they go back and do? They decided that they were going to add what we have called a poll tax, and said that you will pay fines, fees, restitution, interest on those in order for you to be eligible to register and vote. And by the way, if you registered in the first 3 months, we will not go back and criminalize or prosecute you if you registered in those first 3 months knowing of the law. But if you don't go back and correct the record, you can be prosecuted, right? And so just the most amazing set of barriers that are being put in place. And so there are a number of groups that are working to try to help folks overcome it. Mark Elias, a number of groups on the ground are actually in litigation on this issue. I'm hoping that the courts will decide consistent with how the people of the state of Florida decided, where 65% of us said that we believe in second chances and that you ought to have your right to vote. 65% Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and others decided that they wanted that to be the law of the land. Yet the Republican legislature and governor decided that they were going to upend that and essentially nullify what we passed about 65% in November.
And that's consistent with what Republicans did are doing in Michigan and Missouri, where the population voted for a nonpartisan redistricting commission, which Republicans are like, well, wait a minute, so our thumb won't be on the scale, and this is going to be fair. Passed by the citizens in November. Republican legislatures come in and then try to undo what the citizens have voted for. In Wisconsin and North Carolina, Democratic governors are elected. The Republican legislatures then go into special session between the time of the election and the time the governor is sworn in, and try to take power away from the governor, from the newly elected Democratic attorneys general. So they are, again, unrepentant in what it is that they are prepared to do, and it means that we have got to be prepared to fight. This is not, I don't want to at the end of the day say, well, we made a good effort. I want to win.
That's right.
And this is a fight. This is not, from my perspective, a partisan fight. This is a fight for our democracy. Now, I happen to think that in a fair fight, a fight that is consistent with the ideals of our democracy, that progressives and Democrats will do just fine. But that's what I think we have to be prepared to do. We have got to be prepared to fight.
And prepare. And inform.
Prepare.
And
Right.
I say this because oftentimes, one of the things that we learned in 2014 is that we kept telling people how the disruption of the Voting Rights Act was going to disrupt our life. And that suppressed the vote. And so we took a different tactic in 2016 and realized that we had to inform people matter-of-factly what kind of information, what kind of ID they needed, and what kind of rights they had. And we partnered with the Lawyers Committee, and we partnered with NALEO, and people felt invigorated that they knew what their rights were, but also they knew they were equipped with the information. But the other thing that we need to be prepared for is, and I hate coming back to over-registering, but we have to over-register our hearts out, because what we also know that they do very well is they purge our vote. When President Trump tried to create a commission that questioned 2 to 3 million voters, calling them illegal, we knew that he was speaking about the Latino community specifically. And so when we talk about how do we inform people that make sure that they're enfranchised, we have tons of studies demonstrating that a Latino will come in and say, look, I'm supposed to be on the voting rolls, and 9% of them will say, actually, you're not supposed to be, when in fact that's wrong, and 5% of white voters are. The same, they mirror almost African American numbers when it comes to disenfranchisement. So we have to make sure that our folks are informed of what their rights are in those counties, and basically say, even if they don't accept the ballot, say you need to give me at least a provisional ballot, so that we have something to contest. And Mark Elias does that beautifully. He contests everything. I don't know how he sleeps at night.
Can I also say on this voter purge piece, because I do think that is something that each and every one of us can actually take an affirmative step. Leaving this conference, leaving this conversation, I know you've got more, to do than you've got time to do it in, but getting to the information around who's been purged in your state. So far in Florida, we've had over almost 200,000 people purged just in 2019 from the voter rolls. Now, originally, these folks could be purged if as a way of identifying whether or not a person has left the state and you're someplace else. Well, now what we apply to these purges is when was the last time you voted? If you missed a cycle or two, these supervisors of elections in all 67 counties are applying their own criteria and removing people from the voter rolls. Of the folks who have been removed in a partisan way in the state of Florida, Democrats versus Republicans, Democrats have been removed 10 times the rate of Republicans in the state. So what has become principle for us when on a re-registration effort like ours is we're culling all that data and going back to those individuals who've been taken off, letting them know that they've been taken off, and trying to get them re-registered and back in the process. Every one of us in our own states can request that kind of data from the Secretary of State's department or our own supervisors of elections departments and take that information into our own hands. That's something very practical that we can do by way of trying to overcome what they're going to do. To quote some of the seniors I talked to, they gonna do what they gonna do anyway, but we also have tools within our quiver that we can do to help counteract and counterbalance some of those efforts. And looking at those purge rolls and trying to get those folks re-engaged is, I think, one very tangible thing we can do in the 50 states around the country.
Can I just add one thing, which is that basically everything that we've been talking about on this panel predated Trump. And
Yes.
almost all of it happened at the state level. So I think one thing that to me is being lost in 2020 is that we're not just going to elect the next president, hopefully a new president, but that we are going to be picking the state legislatures, the secretaries of state that in most states control how elections are run and how policy is made. I know, A.G. Holder has been talking a lot about this. But for example, on gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has said you can't challenge partisan gerrymandering in federal courts anymore, but you can still challenge it in state courts. Well, how many people are thinking about the makeup of state courts in states where judges are elected? They thought about that in North Carolina. And actually, that was one place where the Republican Party's attempt to take over the courts backfired. And now there is a 6-1 Democratic majority on state courts in North Carolina. But I don't think that many people in the progressive orbit, that many people in the Democratic Party are thinking about state courts, state legislatures, secretaries of state, and the fact that what happens in 2020 is going to be so pivotal, starting in April 2020 with the census, and then in are people prepared for March of 2021? Right, when the next cycle of redistricting happens. I know you're prepared, but I think a lot of other people are not prepared about this. And this is getting such a fraction of the attention compared to the presidential race. And no one is saying, don't talk about the presidential race. We're just saying, spend a little bit of time focusing on all of this other stuff that in many ways is going to determine the course of democracy for the next decade at the state level.
Well, I'd say spend a whole bunch of time focused on what's going on at the state level. Now, I understand that this presidential election, all presidential elections are important. This next one is existential in its importance. I mean, we cannot have another 4 years of Donald Trump and the most corrupt administration in the history of the United States. We cannot have that. But we have to pay attention to, and I hate this term, down ballot races, as if they are somehow less important, because the reality is, if we continue to have these gerrymandered state legislatures, they, for instance, could hobble the next Democratic president by redrawing themselves into power in the United States House of Representatives 2021 and 2022. In 2022, you could have, again, as we've had in this last 10 years, Democrats getting significantly more votes than Republicans for the House of Representatives and having 30, 40 seat being 30, 40 seats below the majority, to be in the minority. That can happen again. And again, they will do this. They have that capacity. Progressives and Democrats, we tend to follow the system. We want to play by the rules. These folks don't apparently get bothered by rule breaking. They think only what the bottom line is. And if you don't think that these gerrymandered state legislatures will, again, as I said, draw themselves into the majority at the House of Representatives level, stymieing the efforts of a Democratic progressive president, you're kidding yourself. And so vote and focus on, who ought to be the next president, but devote a significant amount of your time to working to make sure that we have an effort to elect people at the state level who will stand for a fair redistricting process.
So Attorney General Holder, as the ranking lawyer on this team,
Or the only lawyer?
I have
That's kind of
I have a question of legal strategy that perhaps you could explain, because there are many people in our audience who are neither lawyers nor political science nerds like me. And so they hear that the Supreme Court said you can't sue around extreme partisan gerrymandering. It is a political question beyond our purview. And then they hear that there's a state court that is using essentially the same grounds as the appeal to the Supreme Court, equal protection, one person, one vote, freedom of speech, but the state court is able to overturn the partisan gerrymandering. And there's even been some suggestion that Justice Kagan in her dissent kind of laid out a path. So maybe you could explain to those of us who aren't deeply immersed in the law, how could it be that state courts could be doing something that the Supreme Court chose not to do?
Supreme Court blew it. Seriously, the point you make is a good one. These state constitutions that mirror the federal constitution and which are being used in the state courts now to get at the problem of partisan gerrymandering, those same provisions could have been used, I think successfully should have been used, in the case that was brought before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's decision, I think, coupled with what the court did in Citizens United, what they did in Shelby County, and now the partisan gerrymandering case, that's a suite of cases, of anti-democracy cases that I think will forever stain the reputation of the Roberts Court. I think in the way, I don't know if this is getting a little in the weeds here, but in the way that lawyers look back on the Lochner era in the early part of the 20th century, where the Supreme Court did a whole variety of things to try to undermine, the New Deal. And that's a really now, that's a discredited part of the Supreme Court's history. I think what we're going to see 50 years from now, maybe even sooner, is that suite of cases will demonstrate the anti-democratic bent, the partisan bent, the ideological bent of this court. But there is no basis for a split. Now, what we have all right, so the Supreme Court has ruled, and so therefore we will bring cases, the NDRC will bring cases in the state courts. We will support candidates who will stand for a fair redistricting process. We will also support the creation of these nonpartisan commissions, and we also have a big advocacy effort to make sure that people are fighting for a fair census, which is the foundation of a fair redistricting process, and then make sure that people are looking at, in Wisconsin, the last time, this is literally true. Let's say this is the state, the floor of the state legislature in Wisconsin. They went into a room back over there, drew the maps, and came out and just told everybody, vote on these maps. Vote on them. And they created it's between Wisconsin and North Carolina as to which is the most, Ari, you can figure out which one's the most gerrymandered state.
It's like the Iran-Iraq war of gerrymandering.
Yeah. Well, which is the most gerrymandered state in the country. And by having an advocacy effort where people are focused on this, they won't making sure there's a greater degree of transparency, I think that will decrease the possibilities that we'll have that kind of thing. So we have a whole range of tools that we will be using, including bringing racial gerrymandering cases in the federal courts, which we can still do. One
thing I thought was really interesting about the decision in North Carolina that struck down partisan gerrymandering in state court. I mean, I totally agree with you, A.G. Holder, that there shouldn't be a distinction between state and federal courts. And you can actually probably argue that federal courts are better equipped to deal with these things than state courts, which have to do with all sorts of other state issues. But nonetheless, in North Carolina, what the state court said when they struck down the partisan gerrymander for state legislative districts, they said, our state constitution has protections for voting rights that are not in the federal constitution. for very good reasons, that the founders didn't want to put those things in there. So there are these state constitutions, some of them were written later, some of them were amended during Reconstruction, so have this language in there. They have explicit protections for voting rights. There was something like in North Carolina called the Fair Elections Clause.
Right.
31 states have that clause in their constitution that gives people more protection for voting rights. So I think this is now very in the weeds, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity to explore potential remedies here at the state level that I think we haven't really thought about. And the fact that we may not have these protections in the federal constitution, but we might actually have them in state constitutions, and that's a tool that people can use going forward.
And to just kind of quantify this, in Pennsylvania, a suit was brought using the Pennsylvania state constitution to challenge the gerrymandered congressional delegation that Pennsylvania was sending to Washington. 18 congressional seats, 18 members of the House of Representatives, 13-5, 13 Republicans, 5 Democrats, in a state that is roughly 50-50, tends to lean Democratic. Lawsuits brought, basis of the state constitution, maps redrawn in a fair way. That delegation is now 9-9. And so that is what can happen when you have these lawsuits that are brought, the lines are redrawn, and the process is fair.
Thank you. I think we are ready to go to audience questions. Who's doing the mics? Okay. I see one question in the back there.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
I'm Robin Leeds, and I had the honor of working in the Clinton administration. My first campaign was to implement the National Voter Registration Act in a number of public agencies where recipients receive benefits. It was an uphill battle. It was a very exciting initiative. It was the second bill that President Clinton signed into law. And we are still faced with the NVRA not being implemented, being blocked, and also not being used as an opportunity to register voters when they receive public benefits. And I wanted to ask where that fits into our overall strategy for increasing participation, and how we can use that as a tool going forward between now and the registration deadlines.
I think we could talk a little bit about what states are doing to modernize what you're speaking of. And I would say right now the holy grail is California, where they have automatic voter registration when you turn 18 years old, but they've gone a step further and done automatic pre-registration once you turn 16. And the more that we can model states to do that, the more that we'll have total enfranchisement. There's actually now a piece of legislation that's going to be celebrated on National Voter Registration Day that will look to get passed so that we can have universal voting. And I think absent that, we're going to have, and it has to be done definitely at the federal level, but it's going to be more than likely happening at the local level where the Secretary of States are demanding that this happen and where audiences are and constituents are demanding that it's happened. But for example, Voto Latino, we were the fiscal sponsor and we were one of the co-founders of National Voter Registration Day. And the amount of enthusiasm from all 50 Secretary of States, it was a nonpartisan day. On the very first time, we helped register over 300,000 Americans. Because corporations came on board, the secretaries came on board. It was a whole unity of, obviously, a lot of the media companies came on board, obviously a lot of grassroots organizers, but it was this sense of patriotism that people realized that we have to be able to ensure that people are enfranchised, and the more that we can use those sort of opportunities to get corporations involved, and I know this is kind of counterintuitive, but to get corporations involved in those sort of access to the ballot and to register, it makes a huge difference. Patagonia, for example, closes their stores on election day to ensure people are participating. We need more corporations to come on board to say this is actually why we have a healthy, thriving democracy, and this is why we're able to do industry. It's because we have individuals that are participating. But absent that, I know that when we worked very closely with the Obama administration on National Voter Registration Day, one of their concerns was they felt that it would have been too political, believe it or not, and this is what we were driving to, too political to put voter registration on every single government form website. And that was disheartening, but it was because it had already been this idea that voting only belonged to one party was what happened, was sort of why we are here today.
I mean, we can't buy into those kinds of
No,
things.
of course not.
I mean, the reality is that, we should be making it easier
Yeah.
to register, making it easier to vote. We can't buy into this notion that somehow this is going to increase voter fraud. The Brennan Center says you're more likely to cast an in-person fraudulent ballot than get hit by lightning. The same odds. Voter fraud does exist in North Carolina, where the Republicans were stuffing ballots.
Right.
There's that, but let's not go there.
Yeah. Well, and it's counterintuitive. Oftentimes people try to say, well, when the president's trying to say that 3 million folks that were undocumented tried to vote, that's counterintuitive only because by signing a federal form, you are actually now a felon.
Right.
If people who are already afraid of the government all of a sudden trying to participate and stand 4 hours in line, come on now. That's nonsense.
And some basic questions. I mean, like, why is our election day this first Monday in November?
First Tuesday.
First Tuesday. See? I was testing you all. The first Tuesday in November. I mean, think about it. I mean, I understand it has something to do with crops and agrarian nature and all this stuff.
Farmers used to bring their crops to the market.
Yeah.
on a
All
Tuesday in
right.
November.
We're a little different country now than we were then. I
But
mean,
to your
But there are
suppressive
models.
point of that, there were mailings going out in some districts around the country that said certain people vote on Monday and others vote.
I must have gotten one of those.
I mean,
You got that.
I mean, when you talk, I mean, in all
Which is
fairness,
shameful.
and I'm sure the secretary knows this, but in the Latino community, Facebook ads were showing that you can
Yeah.
text to vote for her, targeting the Latino community on Facebook, right?
Yeah.
And so, where is the oversight? What's the responsibility?
Well,
and those are
except,
real.
except in parts of North Florida, there were supervisors of elections that were taking text, faxed, and email votes in highly Republican counties in 2018. And by the way, that's also to say nothing of the fact that due to the Mueller report, which had no real, directive toward going into the state of Florida to determine how well our system had been compromised, but we were able to learn that 2 Florida counties indeed were intruded upon by the Russians. And guess what? The government still has yet to tell us which 2 counties those are in the state of Florida. And they said it's protecting, methods and sources. I'm thinking, well, the only people who don't know the methods and sources are the people who are impacted. The Russians know exactly what they did, but the people whose votes were, potentially impacted, we don't know. And then
And
are
we're
we to
sure it
assume-
wasn't Broward.
Well, actually, I got a lot of theories on the where, but very, very concerning that our own government appears not to be taking this very, very seriously from the top of the government and throughout that administration. And the worst part about it is I have no expectation that this administration under this current leadership is actually going to take affirmative steps here, largely because this president ties his legitimacy of his presidency to the fact that he has to quell any legitimate information that would suggest that the Russians had an impact on the outcome of the election. So the fact that he feels very, very, very tied to rejecting and himself, trying to claim these things to be false, all because he doesn't want to be considered an illegitimate. He is, in my opinion, an illegitimate, but whatever.
But I think briefly to your point, I think that one way that just briefly to your point, one way that we safeguard democracy is looking at other models. Australia demands automatic voter registration. Everybody has to be registered, and if not, they incur a fine. Is the fine $20? If it's $60? How do we actually ensure that there's enfranchisement? And I think that you have groups such as ours right now actually conducting a government function of registering voters, and that seems incredibly obscene. Our job should be persuading people on how to vote and how to participate, but it shouldn't be a government function.
Agreed.
And there's a question right over here. Right there. Whoever
I have
is
it.
next to
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Cooley. I'm a freshman political science major at Howard University. And my question, thank you. My question was, for people my age, how do I encourage them to go out and vote after the 2016 presidential election? A lot of people my age felt really discouraged, and as if that when they vote for the first time coming up, that it's really not going to count for anything because of the Electoral College. So how do I encourage them to register?
Get them to move to Wisconsin.
I was actually going to make a play for Florida, but And I only need about 30,000 of you to relocate to the state. So Maria mentioned this earlier in the conversation, that one of the most compelling ways in which you can move people to participating in the process is frankly by peer-to-peer contact. A lot of people think you got to put TI on the radio, rapping about what it means to go out and vote and participate in the process. That's not to demonize the role that celebrity plays in this whole thing, but believe it or not, you probably have a bigger impact on whether or not your friends register and participate in the election over any one of us in this room. So I think the peer-to-peer piece is going to be really, really important. And our race in the state of Florida, a race that was expected to draw about 6.1 million voters, and presidentials, we come close to 9 million or so voters. We had 8.5 million people vote, and we had young people, 18 to 35, double their participation in the election over the last gubernatorial election in the state. Maria also pointed out this point, which is your generation, of which I'm no longer in, will be the largest share of the voting bloc should you choose to exercise it. And so, I said it a little earlier. I mean, somebody's trying to fight so hard to take something away from me. My inclination is not to bend to their will and give it, right? It's to buck up and to fight back for what is mine. And I'm hoping that through some peer-to-peer work that we may do a better job of convincing people that these folks are working overtime so hard to take your vote out of the process because they know what it means when your vote actually gets counted, when you actually participate in the process. You change elections. The election can be changed based off how you, your peers, and many of us in this room choose to vote.
And I think, one of the things that we saw is the midterm was the largest participation in American history in 100 years. And what we voted in was the most reflective Congress. And what Congress has done is actual legislate. They've been doing their job. So before, I would have to have conversations with the young people saying, no, trust me, it really works. We actually have examples of it working. And whether you care about reproductive choice, whether you care about pay equity, whether you care about background checks, we now have receipts of what happens when people work for us. And I would encourage to have that conversation. And I would really encourage you to download Voter Palette. It's super easy.
and guess what, last point here, and that is that even in the races where we didn't see victories as in wins, take Georgia, for instance, take Florida, take Texas, and maybe there's some other races around the country that you might be able to point to, you saw record turnout, and you saw in many places people who society says shouldn't be in control and in power. In Stacey's case, the first African-American woman to be nominated on the Democratic ticket as the head of that ticket. In Florida, I'm the first person of color on the Democratic ticket to be nominated to lead that ticket. Those are all incremental steps. And so maybe we didn't win the transaction, but you don't give up just because one transactional setback, right? You stay in the fight until the next time, and the next time, and the next time after that.
Thank you guys so much.
And I would just to state the obvious, despite how screwed up the Electoral College is, there were still only 80,000 votes decided the election in 3 states. And there was a whole lot of young people that didn't vote because they thought that their vote wouldn't matter. It was already in the bag in those 3 states alone that decided the election. And the other thing is, if you look at the grand scheme of progress, you just look at what it took to pass the Voting Rights Act. You're talking about you start in, you can go back a long way, but you had to have the Montgomery bus boycott in '55, and then you had to have the Freedom Rides, and then you had to have the sit-ins, and then you had to have the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, just to get the Voting Rights Act. And if people had said after 57, well, there's some stuff we don't like in this bill, so let's just stop, right? Then you wouldn't have ever gotten to that point. And I think the right, in the same way, you look at the rights campaign against the Voting Rights Act. Conservatives challenged the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act right after it passed in 1965. They lost. In 1966, the Supreme Court upheld the Voting Rights Act in an 8-1 decision in 1966. And so, that should have been the end of it. It was upheld as constitutional. You'd thought it would have been settled. It should have been settled, but they didn't think, oh, this has been settled, let's stop trying to chip away at this. They had a 50-year campaign then to try to stack the courts, stack the Senate, do all the other things you need to do to get a Supreme Court that would then gut the Voting Rights Act. And I'm not saying it should take 50 years to protect voting rights in the same way, but I'm saying that I think sometimes, young people, progressive Democrats, there's a lot of instant gratification that happens that we think about. And I think sometimes you have to think about things in the way the other side thinks about, which is always with a very long view in terms of how things work.
And since I'm the oldest one up here, I'll be the dad wagging the finger now. I mean, and this isn't just for young people. And let me make this really clear. This is not for young people. This is for us generally. We owe a debt to people who sacrificed, who gave their lives, so that we would have the right to vote, so that my generation would have opportunities that my parents' generation did not have, and hopefully your generation will have opportunities, more opportunities than I have had. So we owe that debt, and we dishonor the people who fought, who died, who sacrificed, if we do not participate in a way that they made possible. And so, all the reasons I think that have been shared here make a great deal of sense, but from my perspective, there is that core belief, John Lewis getting his head cracked on the bridge in Selma, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, is almost meaningless if I don't vote, I mean, this is something that from me, Teresa was kidding about it before. I judge people, and people tell me, I don't vote. Really? I got a problem with you then. I got a serious problem with you, given what people have done to try to keep the vote away from us over not only the past few years, but forever. That is how we define citizenship, the ability to vote. Think about those sacrifices. Think about the debt that we owe. Everybody should be registered and everybody should be voting. Don't just put it on young people. Don't just put it on young people. There's a whole bunch of old folks who need to be out there voting as well,
Amen.
Thank you.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Ryan Roy, and I work at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AJC. We actually sued the Trump administration citizenship question and won in the Maryland District Court, and our allies actually won in the Supreme Court. My question for the panel is, as a person whose job it is to raise awareness on the census in the Asian American community, what advice do you have on how we can educate people on why filling out the census is so important and critical for increasing political power for minorities, given the fear that exists around the form today, because the damage that the citizenship question has already created?
I can start, and then I'm sure you have thoughts about this. I mean, the census really is the basis for economic and political power in America. I think a lot of people don't think about the census that way. They don't think about the census at all. Or if they think about it, they think of it as some boring, wonky, dry survey. And they don't realize how it connects their lives in terms of determining who their representatives are or determining programs they use. I mean, I was just going through, the census determines how $880 billion in federal funding is allocated for basically everything we use. I mean, Medicare, Medicaid, Section 8 housing, Pell Grants, school lunches. I mean, so everyone, either their parents are using it, or we're using it, or our kids are using it. I mean, so the census affects all of those things, and so many of us live in places where we're already at risk of having an undercount, meaning that we live in more diverse areas. We live in areas that are welcoming in immigrants. Those are the kind of places that are most at risk of not being counted, meaning we're not going to get our fair share of funding and we're not going to have our fair share of political power. And so I think it's really important to just talk about what the census does, talk about the fact that census information is confidential. Even if Donald Trump wants to get his hands on all that information, he can't legally do it. Now, I still am a little worried about that, quite frankly, but it is built into the law that you can't do it. And then, I mean, I think just make people aware of the census in the first place, because I think the citizenship question was terrible and misguided. The only positive about it, though, was that it made people think about the census and that there is a census coming out. And now what I worry about is that even though the citizenship question isn't on the census, there's still a big risk of an undercount. But is the attention and the money going to be there to make sure that people are still counted? And I think I hope it is, but I think that's still an open question. I think a lot of the groups, like your groups, are going to have to pick up the slack because the Trump administration isn't running the census very effectively, even in an ideal world. And so it's going to be more important than other that nonprofit groups and other organizations pick up the slack here.
And I mean, to underscore, when people say, well, what's the big deal about the citizenship question? There's 16 million Americans that live in mixed status families, meaning that one person in that 16 million may be undocumented. And so it was by design to put fear in Americans and those and their loved ones. And when people say, well, the census not only accounts for what government benefits you get, but it also decides where industry is going to put manufacturing jobs. It decides where we're going to lay fiber optic. It decides who's going to build medical facilities. When I talked to individuals, last time you had roughly 5 million children under 5 that were not counted. So when your child goes to school on the first day of kindergarten and there's not a desk, it's because you forgot. And so it's not just economic, it's educational. It goes all the way down the line. And we have to make sure that when we have these basic conversations, targeting, and disproportionately the ones that end up filling the census are actually the moms, not shockingly enough, is having the conversation of how this literally translates into your child's well-being. 35% of those 5 million that were not counted last time were Latino. And it was because we forgot that the 2-3-month-old was a person, but it was also because out of fear that we didn't want them to be targeted. And so we have to dispel that fear with facts, and we have to just do it quickly, because I do think that it's going to be on the onus of nonprofits such as ours in order to dispel that, because there is it is a concerted effort sadly by this government not to fulfill its duty of the Constitution. It's one of the few things that the Constitution actually requires, is that every single person within our borders gets counted.
Not to miss the obvious point in the census, obviously representation. Right. In my state and in many others, you got a bunch of prisons that are spread throughout many rural areas where they're counting the folks that are there. Yep. They're assigning representation in Congress and in the legislature and houses and senates based off these numbers, pulling down those resources. Look, the reason why this administration went the citizenship route, and one of their questions on there is so that they could achieve undercounts in Texas and Florida and California and all these places that they're terrified of the coming, or what is already present, demographic shifts and political shifts. So why not just maneuver this thing so you can reduce the power and give representation where it actually does not belong, as a way of staving off the inevitable? I keep calling this like the last stand, but I'm really hoping 2020 is the last stand and we really do push past this thing and we can start to live in where the true power belongs. And right now, I just think they're artificially, they talk about China manipulating dollars and money all the time. Well, I would accuse these Republicans and leadership of manipulating power right here in the United States for the purpose of controlling it, while really keeping it from the folks in the demographics, communities who actually ought to be the ones holding that power in the first place.
And just something to underscore, so most of the prison populations you will find in rural communities, and that artificially inflates the numbers, so they're not counted to where they came from. What's happening right now is very similar with detention systems. Right now in the Midwest, you have roughly 33,000 beds that are being built, propped it up. So unlike the Obama administration, we could have an argument of where he would process individuals and deport them individuals back quickly. Trump does not do that. He's actually holding people. So when he's holding people longer, and he's creating these beds, and they are going to be counted in the census. And when I did a follow-up question, it's like, well, where are they going to be counted towards? They don't belong to anybody, right? These individuals. And so when you're saying that you're going to have 33,000 beds all of a sudden in Midwest Midwest rural counties, where margins of voters actually depend on the gerrymandering, those are real questions that we should be asking. What is the purpose?
I think we have one more question here.
Hi, my name's Mary Lise Voss, and my connection to education has been setting up federally funded programs to train American workers into cybersecurity careers. And in cyber, it's like a chess game. We have to think from all angles and at least several steps ahead. So my question is about strategy. For decades, Republicans have operated strategically and practiced message discipline very effectively, while sometimes the left is said to eat itself. My question is, how can we on the left, especially in our voting activism, ensure that the Democratic Party and committee operate in a unified and strategic manner? Where is our grand plan?
Different ones of us.
Well, I'm not sure where the grand plan is, but we ought to be students of history, Because the reality is that Hillary Clinton would be president of the United States now if we were strategic, if we were unified. And, I don't know who the Jill Stein is going to be in 2020,
It's real.
but that's a nonsense vote. It's a nonsense vote. And any Democrat who does not sign up for, let's have a really robust conversation and campaigns about who the nominee should be. But once that person is picked, every damn Democrat needs to be doing everything that he or she can to elect that person. And I don't want to see any Democrat being dragged reluctantly along. The stakes are too high.
That's right.
The stakes were too high in 2016. If Hillary had been, if the senator, secretary,
All apply.
my friend, had she been elected, you think about how different these last 2-3 years would have been. Supreme Court, fundamentally different, Stole Merrick Garland's seat, but if we have President Clinton to appoint somebody, that changes the dynamic, not only for now, but probably for the next 20, 30 years. I mean, we ought to be able to look at what happened and use that as the basis for, as you say, the necessary strategy that we have to put in place. But this is pretty simple. Like I said, fight, pick the person, and then support that person, and forget the nonsense third-party person. I love Susan Sarandon as an actress. I don't want to hear anything from her when it comes to politics, okay? That's going to get me thrown out of Hollywood, but
But you have another job.
Yeah. Yes.
More important.
So I think we're at a point where I should thank our panel members for what I think has been an extraordinary tutorial.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
What's he going to say? No. Kind of getting to your point. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice, but that arc doesn't bend by itself.
Right.
It only bends when people like you put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And I think it is the responsibility of each and every one of us not only to come to wonderful forums like this, but the question is, what are you going to do when you leave? What are you going to do with your friends? Somebody had raised that. What are you going to do to convince other people to make sure that they are counted in the census, that they register to vote, and that they ultimately then do vote? We're the ones who are responsible for bending that arc, pulling that arc towards justice. We can't wait for the cavalry. We are the cavalry.
Right.
We are the change. And so I hope we'll all leave here with, infused with the notion that we control our destiny, that we do have that capacity. There are more of us than there are of them. People who are dedicated to our democracy, dedicated to fairness. We can do this if we stay united, if we stay focused, if we understand that obligation that we have to those who made all the opportunities that we have possible. We can do this.
So thank you for summarizing the theme of the conference. And I would now like to thank this extraordinary panel. This is not a topic about which I'm completely ignorant, but I have to say I learned a lot just sitting up here listening to you, and I'm sure all of you feel like we've been witness to an extraordinary tutorial on the subject. So please give them a good round of applause.
Good job, sir.
And on this note, I would like to end the conference. Thank you for coming. Thank you on behalf of the Albert Shanker Institute, the American Federation of Teachers, Onward Together. Thank you on behalf of Randy Weingarten, who unfortunately couldn't be here, Secretary Clinton, and lastly, thank you on my behalf.